Nanapua o Hawaii Kupa ama hope o ka aina Iki mai ka elele o ka loko ino Pala pala
Ano ai me ke aloha in a makamaka, and welcome to A Second Glance, where we take an in-depth look at issues in and around Hawaii. You know, a great event occurred on the 7th of September 2007, and that was the adoption by the General Assembly of the United Nations of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. A few days ago, I was on a different television program, one of the Olelo programs, with a trustee from the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, Walter Heen, along with Professor John Van Dyke of the William Richardson School of Law. And we had as a topic a discussion of that Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's an excellent document, a document that many indigenous peoples throughout the world have been working on and working for a number of decades. And as we discuss the contents of that important document, I expressed that there was actually a second side to the story. The document itself expresses what the rights are of indigenous peoples, but how we got to that expression, the events that occurred at the Working Group on Indigenous Populations first, and then it subsequently changed to indigenous peoples, and the interaction that occurred during that period of time is very important, but you are not able to see it in a document that is simply discussing standards or rights of indigenous peoples. And as I had expressed that in preparing for today's program, I was also concerned about the story of involvement, of even my involvement in the international arena since the 1980s. And so I sort of had to get into a debate with myself. On one hand, not wanting to talk about myself and praise myself about this and that and the different places and things that I had done, and yet realizing that we must all be responsible for our activities and the importance of transferring this information to those who will follow us. And others can judge the merit or the demerit of our action, but at least the story should be told. And so in that vein, I am taking this opportunity to share with you some of the things that many of you have not heard about and will probably never hear about if I am not at this time taking the time to remember, to memorialize the events that I and others who have been associated with me have taken in this travel into this international arena in the quest for Hawaiian sovereignty. And so for those of you who may see it as self-praising, I apologize for it in advance, and at this time you can turn the station if you want. But this is what I think is important to tell the stories of Hawaiians who have made different attempts to get into different avenues to express their self-determination. When one looks back at history, it's always a question of where do we begin? And we find always that the beginning point is not the starting point. The beginning point is just the beginning of the story. So even for myself, it's a matter of debating where do we begin. If we go back a long enough period of time and we step out of the arena of Hawaii itself, we go to a period of 1917, 1918, 1919. During the development of the League of Nations, there were actually two indigenous people forerunners of the current indigenous rights movement, who traveled to Geneva, Switzerland, and knocked on the doors of this Palais Wilson, a building named after American President Woodrow Wilson, who was so instrumental in the creation of the League of Nations. Although the United States did not join the League, he was instrumental in the creation of the League. And as the members of the League of Nations began their initial meetings, there was a man from North America representing the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, or the Six Nations Confederacy. It's along the east coast of North America. And his name was Diskahe, an American Indian. Actually, I understand that by blood he was actually a Caucasian, but they had adopted him into the Indian nations, very similar to our Hawaiian system, where an ali'i very close to Paea Kamehameha was John Young, the man who held Kamehameha as he died, and said, "Oh, my chief, are there any words that you want to leave for us?" And as a result of that, you have even our songs today of the last words of Paea Kamehameha. You will notice that in my age, I'm drifting and I get into many different stories, and they all seem to come cluttering in. But the thing is that Diskahe was a person representing the Six Nations Confederacy, and he knocked on the doors of the Palais Wilson. And not only he, but there was another man from the Pacific, and his name was Ratana. And Ratana was an ali'i who comes from Aotearoa. And he traveled to Switzerland to gain entry into the League of Nations. And they were saying essentially that they represented nations and they should be given entrance as members into the League of Nations. Now, of the nations that were members of the League, Japan had initially wanted to welcome them into this new formation, or this new international arrangement, until Japan was informed that you better be careful because you too have indigenous people, and that of course is the Ainu. And so the doors were eventually closed, not eventually, were slammed shut, I've heard, to these two indigenous representatives, saying that they were representing nations as well. So the trek of indigenous peoples into the international forum, it does not begin in the 1980s, in the creation of the United Nations Working Group on Indigenous Populations. We do come from a history of others who have struggled, and these are just two examples of those who entered the international arena to advocate for the rights of their indigenous peoples. But moving further ahead in time, we come to Hawaii in the 1970s. At least my story begins at the very early 1970s, where I became conscientized, or became aware of the fact that from an independent nation status, we were conspired against by American citizens, or mostly American citizens, who lived in Hawaii, and they jumped between calling themselves Hawaiian citizens and American citizens, whatever was convenient or opportune at that time. They conspired with the United States Minister Plenipotentiary, John Stevens. And in that conspiracy, they overthrew the Hawaiian government. I found that out while I was in the United States Air Force through a voice that reached out to me from a time almost 100 years before. And that voice was carried in a book entitled Hawaii's Story by Hawaii's Queen. And as I read that book, I changed my political perspective. And so as a member of the United States Air Force, I found it very difficult to maintain this sense of loyalty to a government that was responsible for the overthrow of my Hawaiian nation. I won't go into too much of that story, but at least it gives you a start. So this was in 1970, 1971, And eventually, having left the Air Force, I returned to law school. Previously, I had attended George Washington University in Washington, D.C., but not able to complete even a semester. It was very cold for me. I had just gotten married. The weather, we ran out of money, so I came back to Hawaii and eventually joined the military. Now, after getting out of the military, I went back to law school. This time, the University of Hawaii had just opened its doors, and so I was able to gain entrance into the University of Hawaii. I studied for 4 years, not for 4 years, for 3 years. It seemed like it was 4 years. And eventually took the bar exam, was passed the bar, and was licensed to practice law in the state of Hawaii, as well as in all of the federal courts in Hawaii. And over my practice of law, I was able to represent a number of Native Hawaiians who also saw the injustice of the taking of our Hawaiian nation. And oftentimes when they came to me as an attorney, they asked me to represent them on the basis that they were Hawaiian nationals and not American citizens. And therefore, the issue of jurisdiction of a foreign country, having come into a territory, colonized a territory, and forced citizenship and forced American laws upon the citizens of this indigenous nation, there was something wrong and jurisdiction was not appropriate. So I began to proceed within the judicial system, raising the issues of jurisdiction, challenging the American law or the applicability of American law to Hawaiian citizens. And every time we went to the courts, even when I had my own case and challenged the jurisdiction before the court, the judges would always say, essentially, as they reached the bottom of it, they say, "Oh, very interesting story. I have never heard that story before, but we are all American citizens now, and that's it." Of course, they gained their authority or their jurisdiction, not jurisdiction, their power through the American system. And so my wife, Puanani Burgess, that's Christabel Puanani Burgess, not to be confused with any other Puanani Burgesses. My wife, who is a poet, coined a phrase. She said, "You cannot ask a thief to sit in judgment of itself." And that strikes home to me every time I go before the court and I raise these issues. How can a thief be asked to sit in judgment of itself? But the question is, what other avenues do we have? Where do we turn to? Either whenever we are criminalized or whenever we operate as Hawaiian nationals or as Native Hawaiians. What other avenue do we have? And so I pondered on that question for a while, and I came to the conclusion that we must look beyond the American national borders. If we were an independent nation, subsequently invaded and taken over by another independent nation, the questions that are posed, the conflict that results, is not a conflict to be settled within the domestic laws of one nation or the other nations. These are conflicts of an international character, and therefore we must seek an international jurisdiction or some international venue to resolve these issues. And so I began this trek into the international arena. Many of you already know that I served as a trustee with the Office of Hawaiian Affairs from 1982 to 1986. And I've always said that the Office of Hawaiian Affairs is not Hawaiian sovereignty, but what it can be is a step closer to Hawaiian sovereignty. And so as trustee with the office, I started looking for an international avenue to engage the question of Hawaiian sovereignty. And at that time, the Office of Hawaiian Affairs had still not developed a mindset a personality, descriptive character of what exactly is this new thing, this Office of Hawaiian Affairs, which started operating in 1980. And so among the trustees, many of them had never heard the connection of the term Hawaiian and sovereignty together. And so they were taken aback and to see a radical sitting among them. Yeah, I can understand that they were somewhat concerned, confused, and uncertain as to what their position would be. So that's, I guess, a accurate way of describing the situation in or among the Board of Trustees at the Office of Hawaiian Affairs at that time. But at least I had the liberty to explore different areas. And so with the support of the administrator at that time, who was T.C. Yim, previously a state legislator, a territorial legislator, and he and I had known each other briefly, both of us having served in the 1968 Constitutional Convention. So he had understood my position, and we worked together, and we were able to identify an organization in the international arena that seemed to be appropriate for my further inquiry. And so I wrote a letter, and a letter came back saying that there was going to be a meeting, a regional meeting. The place that I had written to was a place called, or an organization called, the World Council of Indigenous Peoples. And this organization had regional organizations that gathered together as a world council. So you had a region in South America, and their organization at that time was known as CISA. I won't go through the words behind those mnemonics or the acronyms. You had one from Central America, which was known as CORPI. You had a North American region, and most of these members came actually from Canada rather than from the U.S. American Indians, although there were some who were also involved in that regional organization. There was a fourth organization that comes from Scandinavia, and they were known as the Nordic Sami Council. And then you had the Pacific region. At that time, the Pacific region was not very active. Not very active. They didn't have very many members. You had Australia, who was a very active member, New Zealand, who was also very active, and then you had West Papua, which was in a battle and continues to be in a battle with the occupiers, with Indonesia. You had East Timor, which did not receive its independence at that time. You had the Moluccas. No, even the Moluccas Islands was not members of this organization. Tahiti was also had also joined in this organization. So what happened was I was able to travel to Australia, to Canberra, Australia, and traveling with me was Rodney Keli'i Mahi'ai Burgess, who was also a trustee with the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, and there was a Francis Ka'uhane. Francis was a staff member at the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. So the three of us traveled to Canberra in Australia and inquired, and I had been given an opportunity to make a presentation, and so I told the story of Hawaii, of the illegality of the overthrow, the conditions of the native Hawaiians, and the rest, and was invited along with Rod Burgess and Francis Ka'uhane to then go off to the the World Council's general meeting, which would be held in Panama, at Panama City, the following year. So in 1984, we traveled from Hawaii to Panama, and at that time, traveling with the three of us was also Harry Mitchell, Uncle Harry. Gathered there, and what had happened was that we developed major statements of what I consider to be international import. We developed the standards of rights for indigenous people, which actually became the forerunner of the the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And at that time, they held an election for new officers of the World Council of Indigenous Peoples, and I was elected as vice president of the English-speaking regions, and those regions were of Scandinavia, of North America, and of the Pacific. A second vice president was elected to represent South and Central America, and of course we had a president who was overall above the vice presidents. I want to share a story with you. While I was attending to the more formal, legalistic political affairs, Uncle Harry Mitchell had gone for a gathering and in an exchange of culture and an expression of tradition among the indigenous people of many of them from Central America. We had the Kuna Indians, the Guaymi, the Aymara, and others from different parts of that area who had gathered there and came gathered in their traditional dress and the rest. I heard a story later that was told to me by Aussie Cruz, a very good friend of mine from Australia, representing the Aborigines of Australia. He said, "Poka, I need to tell you this. I just saw the most fantastic demonstration of communication that I had ever witnessed." And Aussie was not a young chick. He was about 20 years my senior at that time. And he said, and so I asked him, what was it? He says, Uncle Harry, he's such a fantastic man. There was a gathering, in Hawaii we would say a luau, there was a festival, and you had all these many different elders who had gathered together, and many of them spoke in their own languages, and they spoke very little Spanish. They spoke absolutely no English. There was a translator for Uncle Harry to English, not to Hawaiian, just to English. And they had heard that there was a Hawaiian elder who had come with the Hawaiian delegation. And so they called him up to say a few words of greeting and some political statement, I guess. And so as they waited anxiously to see how Uncle Harry was going to negotiate the language barrier with the audience of people who spoke no English and barely any Spanish. And what had happened was that, Uncle Harry, for many of you who knew Uncle Harry, he would always wear his hat. And on his hat, he would have a feather lei. And so he was in the same way, dressed in his usual manner. He walked upon the stage, and they took him to the microphone. And what he did was he called the elder representative of the Kuna Indians, I believe it was, and he motioned the person to come upon the stage. And the Kuna Indian walked upon the stage, and what Uncle Harry did was not say any word at this point, but he took his hat off and he took the lei off and he placed it upon the head of the elder. And and the crowd went wild, I'm told. And then Uncle Harry said, "Now we are brothers." The indigenous people of Central and South America, like the Hawaiians and like the Polynesians and like the North American Indians, have a special treasure for feathers. They respect feathers as being very powerful, as carrying a particular mana. In fact, in the greeting, oftentimes that you may hear I greet with, or my wife may greet with, is "Ano ai me ke aloha e na hulu manu like ole." Greetings to you, birds of many feathers. And the kauna behind that is in respect to all of you ali'i who are honored with the kapu, or being able to wear feathers. Feathers for our indigenous people are of such importance. And Uncle Harry could translate that immediately and recognize it and be able to communicate through culture. Not even language, just through culture. That's the ability of Uncle Harry as a representative of the ingenuity of our Hawaiian people. So Ozzy said, it was a fantastic event and I'm very grateful for being there, and I have so much regard for Harry Mitchell. And he had that ability of having people gain such high respect for him. Anyway, getting back to the story. So there's a big convention going on in Panama at this major hotel. I've forgotten the name of the hotel. And then we are having campaigning and elections going on. And it may be because of Uncle Harry's good deed. But I was eventually elected as the vice president of the English-speaking region. Very soon after that, I was asked to travel to the United Nations and act as a political spokesperson for the World Council of Indigenous People. And for the next approximately 5 to 6 years, having been re-elected in the subsequent election 4 years later, I became the official representative for the World Council of Indigenous People. Unfortunately, time is running out and I'm not able to get into more of the political work that has been going on. Perhaps in the next session, I'll be able to share some of those stories of times at the United Nations, travels to other countries, getting to know indigenous peoples and their stories, and being able to see Hawaii as a small reflection of what had been going on and has been going on with indigenous people throughout the world. Thank you very much for joining me, and please join me again. Aloha, ahui ho.
Kaulana nā pua o Hawaii, Kupa'a mahope o ka aina, Iki mai ka elele o ka loko ino, Pala pala a nunu me ka paka